In the last section, we introduced some terminology with the Redux library. We had an action, a reducer, a state, and a store. I don't want to talk too much more about this example right now. Let's just dive into actually coding it up. So our goal is to make a tiny Redux application where we can take a string of characters and split them into an array. That's it. That's all we're trying to do here. So I'm going to flip back over to JS Playgrounds, and I can write some JavaScript on the left-hand side here. JS Playgrounds is not hooked up to any type of import or export system. It has direct access to the Redux library. So I can make reference to Redux and I get the library back directly here. I know this looks like it's an empty object, but trust me, it's the actual Redux library. So we're going to basically work with Redux directly. The first thing that we're going to do is create a store. Remember, a store is an object that holds our application state and reducers. So I'll create store, const store equals redux.createStore. Now notice that already we get a nice big error message here down on the bottom right hand side. When we create a Redux store, it expects us to pass in at least one reducer function. Okay, so remember, a reducer is a function that produces some amount of application state. And clearly it's expecting us to pass in at least one when we create a store. So I'm going to pass in a single function as our reducer. So we'll say const reducer is a fat arrow function that returns an array. So just be clear on the syntax here. Reducer is a fat arrow function. It returns an array whenever it gets invoked. Now I'm going to pass that reducer to the create store call. Okay, now boom, error message goes away. So it looks like, all right, this seems reasonable. Something's going right now. Remember that the store contains our application state and all of our reducers, however many we might have for our application. At any point in time, we can ask the store for its current state. So I'll say store.getState. So right now it looks like our entire application state as it stands right now is just a single array. So what does that tell us? It tells us that by default, when we create a Redux store and pass in a reducer, the reducer will be ran, and whatever the reducer returns will become our applications or our Redux store state. So we've now got an application state of just empty array. That's it. All right. If we change the return value from the reducer, our application state will change as well. So if I start to put in 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, you can see that, yep, it looks like our application state is updating as well. So again, whatever the reducer returns is our application state. I'm going to take the 1, 2, 3 out of here really quick. All right, I'm going to flip back over to our diagram real quick, just so we can remember some of our definitions. Here we go. So again, we've now created a store, and we pass that store one reducer. That reducer produces our application state. So that's where we are right now. Next, we're going to create an action. An action is a plain JavaScript object that tells the reducer that it needs to modify the state that it is producing. So we'll first create the action, then tell the reducer how to deal with that action. So back over in JS Playgrounds, I'll create an action. And I'll say it for probably the third or fourth time now. An action is a plain JavaScript object. So I just created a plain JavaScript object right here. The only requirement of an action is that it defines a type property. So when I say type property, I mean literally type. This type property will always be a string. The purpose of this type property is to tell our reducer to commit a very specific operation, like a very specific command or instruction. So it's going to have a type of split string because we want to tell our reducer, hey, I want you to split the string, or a string, some string, whatever. We will also tell the reducer which string we want it to split by passing it on a payload property. It's like ASDF. And I'm going to, there we go, looks better. Okay, so here's our action. It's a plain JavaScript object. It has a type property. The type you can think of as being like a command or an instruction to the reducer. And it has a payload. The payload is the thing, the piece of data that we want to implement, to work on. This is like the thing that we want to do some action to, or we want to like manipulate this thing right here, whatever's on the payload property. Now we're going to update our reducer, which is up at the top, and instruct it how to handle this action right here, okay? Reducers are always called with two arguments. The first is the current state that it has produced, and I know that's very confusing, we will come back to that. And the second is an action. So just bear with me for a second here. We're going to put some code on the screen and then discuss it. I'm going to say state is an empty array, and action. And then I'm going to put down a fat arrow function body. Inside of here, I'll say if action.type is split string, then return action.payload.split. Otherwise, return state. Okay, so what we're doing here is we are saying that we've got a reducer. It gets called with two arguments. For right now, we're going to just ignore that first argument. The second argument will be an action. So we've created an action down here, so you can kind of imagine this object right here appearing inside this reducer as a second argument. If the action's type is equal to split string, and for us it will be, then we're going to take whatever the action's payload property is and split it with an empty string. So it'll turn it into just like an array of characters, ASDF. So that's it. That's all we really need to know about actions right now. The last thing we have to do is figure out how to tell this reducer to run with this action. So I want to like feed this action into this reducer, right? That's like what we're seeing with the diagram over here. I want to take this action and I want to push it into the reducer. So to do that, our very last step, I'm going to call store.dispatch action. And then finally, I'm going to run store.getState again. So now when I run my getState method a second time, you'll see that, okay, it looks like for some reason we had an empty array before, but now we've got an array of characters here, like ASDF. Okay, this has been a really long section, so let's take a quick break and then come back and discuss the absolute minutia of all this code that we just added in.